Hello everybody and welcome back to ChessDiagnostic. Today is Cinco de Mayo, so congratulations about that. And I just wanted to present the official snack of ChessDiagnostic, which is Pepperidge Farm's Chessmen. It's a great snack if you're playing chess or if you are just wanting to eat cookies, I guess. So today we're going to cover a game that was played in 1931 between Aszzztaaaalllos. It's Aszzztaaaalllos. If you know how to say that, leave a comment below. Versus Nimzo. Now, Nimzo is famous for writing a book called My System, but actually this game is going to cover a concept that I picked up from a book called Soviet Middle Game Technique about playing in the spirit of the position. And this is really a really interesting concept because it kind of deepened the idea of a thought process by finding the spirit of the position to know when to calculate and when not to calculate, when to form a plan, when not to. So let's get into it. Let's see what happens here. We see e4, c6, playing the Caro-Kann, knight to c3, and then takes. Now Nimzo plays knight to f6, and after takes, there's really two options here. And the modern option is to take towards the center, open the g-file, and then possibly attack down the g-file and just play in the center. Nimzo chooses pawn takes on e to f6, which actually I like because it clears the way for the bishop and it kind of provides some more structural advantage over on the king side. So let's see here. We see c3, bishop out, bishop to d3, and then castles. After queen to c2 and h6, obviously preventing the bishop from taking that. Knight out, and then queen to c7, kind of preventing white from castling here with this pawn. But also, this is where the spirit of the position comes out. So white really wants to move his bishop and then castle long, and he starts to kind of not really play in that idea. After a couple of moves, we see bishop to e3, obviously preparing to castle long, and that's actually a good plan in this position, to castle long, play, h4, g4, and then kind of storm the king side, whereas black would play b5, a5, and then try to do the same against white on the queen side. Instead, he plays, after knight to d7, queen to d2. So actually white has a slight advantage in this position, but with queen to d2, it's rather a waste of a tempo. He should have just castled long, but obviously his plan with queen to d2 is to sack here, but really he should have calculated before doing that, because with rook to e8 and the knight back, that actually solves all of black's problems after the sack, and he would just be a piece down for two pawns. And actually black would quickly activate. So we'd see something like rook here. Well, let's see. So if he took, then we would see takes, queen takes, and then after knight to f8, takes here, we see queen to e7. So he's won some pawns, but if he tries to keep the queens going instead of just trading, we see black suddenly get active after there, and then obviously if the bishop takes, there will be mate, so he can't do that. After the following moves, with queen check, it's actually an evaluation of minus 3.6 for black, because although white did get pawns for the piece, it's really hard to play this position because black is so active, the queens are still on the board, and this white king is rather exposed. Alright, so let's go back. So we should have evaluated that. Rook to e8, and then we see the somewhat inconsistent move knight to g3. He still could have castled long and started with the simple idea of storming black's king with his pawns, but he plays knight to g3, which is rather inconsistent because now black can play bishop to f4, trading that bishop in the center, and then he castles kingside. So I can somewhat understand why white did this, because he wants to have a 100% safe king, but it's a little passive, and after takes, white isn't worse, definitely not. He actually has a slight advantage in this position because of his strong center. He can play e4. The f file is open, but it's somewhat inconsistent, and he did waste some tempos. So the reason I'm showing this game as opposed to like some brilliancy that Nimzo played is because this is a very common thing in a normal chess game. You're not always going to play some brilliant combination, but a lot of times the spirit of the chess position will say, oh, I should castle queenside or I should castle kingside, and you really need to understand that to make the right moves according to your thought process. So if you can get that nailed down, then you can really make a lot of moves somewhat automatically, and that's a good example of this here. All right, so despite White's passivity, he's actually not in a bad position, so let's see how it proceeds. Knight to f8. So with rook to f2, White's new plan is to play down the f file, and actually it's not a bad plan because he still has some sacrificing possibilities on f6 after he can play e4 and bring the knight in, and his minor pieces are still aiming at the king side. So after queen to e7 and then e4, it's actually White who has somewhat of an advantage because Black is a little passive now himself. Bishop out, and then we see, obviously he wants to play here, but he has to protect that pawn first. c5. So in this position, Nimzo is a little bit passive, but what he needs to do is play in the center and try to create some weaknesses of his own to attack. All right, so obviously White could play something like d5, but it's still equal, as you can see according to the computer, and it would create this e5 hole for the knight to occupy. So he doesn't want to play that yet. Rook in, and then he takes. Now you can see that the computer is suggesting, here let me turn these arrows off here. You can see that the computer was actually suggesting for him to come over and develop his rook, which is in line with activity, but we actually see a tactical mistake by Nimzo with knight to g6. So if you want to pause the video, this would actually be a perfect time to try to evaluate how White could actually get a big advantage against Black. Let's turn this evaluation gauge back on. All right, there we are. The correct move would actually have been e5. And if he took here, we could actually see something like d5, which causes Black a lot of problems because if he takes, then we would see bishop takes. The rook would have to come over because it's threatened. And actually the queen could take here. And actually after takes, move, there's a lot of problems for Black, and actually White is up material. He has a rook and two minor pieces for the queen, and I'd probably pick up more pawns. So actually that would be completely winning for White. White misses it and instead plays d5. Again, not playing in the spirit of the position, because in this position, he really doesn't want to give Black an active square, and with d5, he presents some problems with this backward pawn. Now, the bishop has to go forward because he wants to control these two squares on h4 and f5, h5 and f5. And the reason for that is because White actually has a sack on f6. For example, if he came back here, you could see something like rook takes, and then pawn takes, and with knight to h5, there's all kinds of threats, namely the queen coming in here, check here, so at least you get material back. And it's just a very uncomfortable position for Black. Instead, we don't see that. We see bishop to g4, and inexplicably, we see another misevaluation of the spirit of the position, with White suddenly deciding to just go over to the c file. He must have decided that there's really nothing to be accomplished on the f file, and then he plays rook to c1. Black contests it, goes back, and now you can see the d5 move really causes him some problems because now Black is starting to get active. Now this is a good game to study because it actually shows a very normal kind of chess game where the players are not really sure what to do strategically. Maybe it's a little inaccurate, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily give you a big tactical advantage. But you need to stay tactically sharp because those kind of positions do come about once in a while, but they also disappear just as fast. Queen and then pawn, really nothing to do. The bishop goes back, and white is really unsure of what to do. So let's evaluate this here. The king was quite safe, but now with h3 and the queen and the knight occupying this e5 square eventually, it's actually black who starts to get an advantage. And this is all related to activity. So with queen to g5, he actually has a double threat here of this rook, and then also bringing the knight in. And we're all starting to see things like, the bishop takes h3 if the knight moves. So tactical ideas are starting to appear based on black's greater activity. Takes. Now black has the c file, and he really brings his king over here. It's somewhat of a wasted move, but it's really kind of hard to play in these positions. So basically, because of white's passivity, black is starting to get an advantage. The knight naturally comes in. So white really played passively, and he just gave black an advantage just because he was somewhat passive. Knight to f5. Now we see rook to c1. Tactically, this works for black because if the rook takes, we see knight takes. And all of a sudden, black has just won a piece. So he really has to keep that rook. But now you can see that black has all this activity. The rook is controlling the entire, I guess you could say, the entire first rank of white, and there's really nothing that black can do about it. Chases the knight away. He has to come back. If he tries to just check, he really needs this piece trying to protect his king. The tactics are starting to fly already. Now, it's somewhat complicated if the king takes, but if the pawn takes, it's really simple. We just see a check here. The queen would have to take, and then we would see a checkmate. But if the king takes, then we would see all kinds of problems, something like check. If the queen comes, then we would see rook check here, winning the queen. And if the king comes, then we could still see something like rook now threatening checkmate. Let's see. So if he would have to go queen here, and then we would just chase him away. He can't come here or here. The queen would have to move, and then we would still see checkmate either way because the knight is covering that final square. So he already has problems, and he can't take that bishop. But after the bishop back, bishop goes back again. Now he has threats like queen takes, check. After the king comes in, we actually see a combination after bishop, back, and then if you want to try to solve it from here, it's actually a cool combination with queen takes, rook takes, and for example, if the king comes here, you would see check. So he can't really escape this position. There's really nothing to do except go like queen here. He could go there and then just win the queen, but actually I think there's a checkmate with check here. Go here, check. And then black could do something like this. After a few checks, then he's gonna be mated, or he could come back. So it's a rather surprising game actually, because white had an advantage at multiple points in the game, even a tactical win at one point, but he misevaluated the spirit of the position, and because of that, black just played solid chess, and eventually he gained enough activity to strike back. So this game is very important to study if you want to understand how to kind of find strategy in positions that seem somewhat normal and boring. And I hope it helps your chess, and you don't really have to eat chessmen, but they are pretty tasty. All right, I'll see you in the future. Thanks for watching.